Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
This is where we hold them! This is where we fight! This is where they die!
The clip that you just heard is from the 2006 Hollywood epic 300, which depicts in graphic detail and epic stylistic filmmaking the last stand of the Spartans along the pass of Thermopylae during the year 480 as the Greeks are fighting against the invading Persians. And that is part of the campaign and part of the series of battles that we're going to be talking about today that had a profound change of history as we talk about Thermopylae, but also about the equally important and less Hollywood stylized battle, which is the naval battle at Salamis of the same year in 480. Hi, this is Don Shelley, and welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. And today we're going to hop in the Wayback Machine and we're going to go way back. We're going to go back to the 5th century BC. And we're going to go back to a time when West and East are clashing. And we're going to see what an impact things would have if the outcome of a series of battles, particularly those in 480 BC and ultimately in 479 BC, between the Greeks and the invading Persians had turned out slightly differently. And whether we would think of our society today or even the term the West in quite the same way as we do. So for starters, let's sort of set the stage for the period of time that we're talking about. It is the early 5th century BC, and the Aegean is dominated by a series of Greek city-states that are referred to as polises. And each of these city-states is unique and sort of different in its orientation. Among them we have such places as Athens and Sparta and Corinth, all of them with a slightly different way of governing themselves, and they are all Greek, yet they are all independent from each other. And in fact, we have in the early 5th century BC the rise of what we typically will think of as being the classical Athens, what would lead to the Parthenon, what would lead to the idea of democracy or an infant democracy as it existed. However, threatening the Greek territories is an invader. That invader comes from the east, and it comes in the form of the Persian Empire. It's been simply just 10 years since the Battle of Marathon before, when under Darius the Persians had come and they had sought to take control of the Peloponnesus and to conquer the Greeks. After the invasion, which ended in 490 BC, the defeat at Marathon, Darius was forced to retreat back to the Persian Empire and eventually died a few short years later. His son Xerxes assumes the role of the great king and is now bent upon revenging his father's loss to the combined Greek forces and to reinstate the authority and the power of the Persian Empire and cause it to spread even further to the west and expand its influence over not only politics but trade as well. The army that has been assembled by Xerxes is almost so large and so massive to be beyond the ability to be imagined. The estimates of historians of the day and future historians is that perhaps somewhere between 250,000 to 500,000, maybe as many as 1 million soldiers and support personnel were employed in the invasion, crossing the Hellespont to leave Asia and move into Asia Minor and properly enter the territory that was the combination of islands circling the Aegean that was Greece. Standing against that, even, let's say conservatively, 250,000 man army is maybe 70,000 to 80,000 Greek soldiers from various city-states. These were city-states that were very often at war with each other. However, they were united in the cause of defending the idea of Greece and what that meant to each one of them individually as the various cities and the various political entities against a foreign invader in the form of the Persians. The Greek culture had begun to spread as a result of their skill as seamen, as a result of trade, and so Greek influence had come on to the continent of Asia, which was part of the reason the Persians were looking to push back against that influence and against the commercial prosperity and against the political undermining that might represent. And so in many ways, this is not just a clash of massive armies, it's a clash of cultures, it's a clash of political philosophy, it's a clash of what history had been for each of these different groups up until this time. And certainly as we look at the issue here on A Fork in Time of what would have happened with a different outcome, it's a clash of two future paths down which history may go. This podcast is not intended to be a military history podcast, so we won't spend a lot of time talking about the actual details of the battle, although that's actually a quite fascinating subject. I've included some links in the show notes that will take you to some resources online that can give you a brief summary of the battles and how they were fought and some of the significant elements of military strategy that are there. However, this campaign in 480 BC does include two battles of particular note. I've already mentioned Thermopylae. That's where the 300 movie is based upon and the events there. And then the other is a naval battle, and that's Salamis. And so it is important to talk about each one of those battles because they do play an important role, obviously, in the outcome of the military campaign. But the very things that are happening in those battles with how they are fought, who is fighting them, and their motivations for fighting are also very important because they play into the aftermath of the Greek victory. And that's an important part of who Greece is at the time, what Greece becomes, and then ultimately as a result of that, how Western culture is shaped by the experience of what is Greece. So let's begin with the Battle of Thermopylae. The one, again, that is immortalized in the movie 300. It's been portrayed a number of times in film. It's a dramatic thing to be able to portray. It plays well for Hollywood themes. Here you have the highly trained, from their very youth, culture that is designed to produce fighting men, the Spartans. In fact, the very term that we use when we describe something as being Spartan talks about this existence that is sort of devoid of luxury. It's built upon need and absolutes. And the Spartan culture is organized around this idea of honor and preparing their citizens, soldiers, their men and their women even, to be ready to exercise power through battle. And so we find a very small contingent of Spartans who have chosen to hold a coastal pass here at Thermopylae, which is strategic in the sense that it gives an advantage to the defender in that it's a very narrow section of beach with cliff walls on one side that change the odds when it comes to this army of hundreds of thousands of Persians trying to pass through. They can't present a front that is wide enough to take advantage of their size. There's no flanking because of the sea and because of the mountains on the other side. And so this small group of Spartans are able to hold this line for a period of time against a force that is much, several orders of magnitude larger than they are. And it's only eventually when the Greeks are betrayed by someone who has local knowledge of the territory and shows them the way, sort of a hidden pass, a pathway that goes around this, that the Spartans eventually are able to be surrounded and the Persians are able to be victorious. And so the Spartans, who are all about glory, this is the ultimate setup for them to be able to display their glory of standing as fighting men on the beach, fighting to their last breath, giving their last ultimate sacrifice in defense of their city and of their culture and of who they are. What's interesting about that, though, is that what this action is doing, this stalling action here as they're making this last stand, is it's buying time. What it's buying time for is not for Sparta, it's buying time for Athens and those that are further south in the Greek Peloponnese. And so while Sparta and Athens have very often been throughout Greek history at odds with each other, they've been on opposite sides, even have been at war with each other. In this particular case, it is Sparta, Greek Spartans, that are buying time for the benefit of Athens, Greek Athenians. And so even though they are independent city-states, and even though they've been at odds with each other in the past, this is an instance of it is not as important to be a Spartan or an Athenian as it is to be Greek, given that the invading army is Persian. And so what we see demonstrated here is a larger, quote-unquote, national identity, but yet still retaining the individualism of the city-states and their sort of subcultures inside of Greek culture, even in the way that the battle is being fought. And as a result of that, we see something that continues on in Greek history, where they are both united and yet still independent in the concept of what's going on here. Contrasted with that is the victory. By the way, Thermopylae is a defeat. The Spartans eventually are overcome. The victory is in the sense that they do buy time for Athens and for an effective retreat from Athens that will set up future success. But the Battle of Salamis is a naval battle, and it follows after Thermopylae. It follows after Athens has been taken by the Persians and in fact has been burned. And we have the Athenian admiral Themistocles, political leader, who for the past 10 years has been urging Athens to build Greek triremes, their ships of war, to be prepared for a potential future Persian invasion. And so we see the Athenian navy, a new Athenian navy, approximately 270 ships that are able to be pulled back against the advancing Persian fleet and are prepared to do battle near the island of Salamis. What's also unique about this particular element of the Athenian navy and the role that it takes at Salamis is a mere 10 years before, it was Athenian infantry at the Battle of Marathon, which had been a key instrumental role in the turn back of the first Persian invasion under Darius. And so Athens and certain leaders inside of Athens had grown to positions of power because of the role of Athenian infantry. And if you will, there was sort of an infantry class inside of Athens, which included the landowners and the wealthy elite, who were able to be the generals and leaders of those groups, and were able to raise the hoplite forces, the citizen infantrymen, who they commanded. And as a result of the victory at Marathon, inside of the Athenian political system, the infantry class, the infantry group, had achieved some level of notoriety and some level of power. It's in the midst of that Themistocles is arguing strongly for the growth of an Athenian navy to be stronger, that will give them equal capabilities on the seas. And it's as a result of his efforts, even during the period of time of the infantry in Athens, where the infantry is holding political sway, getting the navy funded and built becomes a key element, so that by the time of the Battle of Salamis, as the Persians now are seeking to finish their conquest of the Greeks, what we have is a navy that can stand against them. Themistocles' strategy, as they're outlined in some of the resources that are provided there, is also in some ways similar to the strategy that's used by the Spartans along the pass, along the beach, in that he takes advantage of the topography and takes advantage of the fact that he's able to force the battle to happen in an area that is narrower than the Persians would have liked. So even though the Persian navy also outnumbers the Athenian navy by about a factor of 3 to 1, the strategies and tactics that Themistocles is able to use and bring to bear sort of levels the playing field. And in fact, they use tactics that take advantage of the unique elements of their ships in terms of how they are designed to be able to move quickly and agilely at sea, but also their oarsmen, who are skilled at being able to move the ships quickly to a flanking speed and ultimately to a ramming speed. And as a result, the battle, when it goes in the favor of Themistocles and the Athenian navy, and they are victorious at Salamis, it's a result of the Athenian political will over the past 10 years that has caused that navy to be built. Part of what has gone on in the democratic struggles inside of Athens and the discussions and debates among the political elite about where funds should be placed and where emphasis should be placed that has led to this. And then there's also an interesting factor that happens as a result of the victory, in the sense that the heroes of the naval battle are obviously the admiral Themistocles, who rises and attains a new position of power. But the other heroes, just like the heroes of the battle 10 years before, had been the infantrymen at the Battle of Marathon, the foot soldiers. In that particular battle, the heroes of Salamis, in so many ways, are the Greek oarsmen who manned the ships and who successfully powered them in the battle against the Persian army. Eventually, the following year, in 789 BC, at the Battle of Plataea, ultimately the Greeks have their ultimate victory over the Persians and drive them back and force them to retreat. That, by the way, represents the last time that a Persian army would venture to try invade, moving westward. And so from that point forward, Greece would be free from becoming a subject to an Eastern power. Of course, eventually they would fall and be subjected to the Romans coming from the west. But following the defeat at Thermopylae, but the benefit of the defeat at Thermopylae with the Spartans falling along the beach, the victory at Salamis, and then the ultimate victory by the combined Greek forces at Plataea, Greek culture wins out. Greek military wins out. And as a result of that, we have a preserved Greece. And we enter into one of the high periods of Greek history in terms of philosophy and art and science. Now, all of that is sort of reborn as a result of their victory over the Persians. That's particularly true in Athens. And in fact, Athens enters into a period of time where democracy, such as it was inside of Athens, not modern democracy, but certainly much more democratic than had been seen almost anywhere else in the world to that point, thrives. And part of that democratic thriving is the fact that the oarsmen, who were the part of the heroes of the naval battle at Salamis, are not those who own land. Yet there is a need to recognize their role in society, their preserving role as a result of the military victory. And so what you have, for one of the first times in history, is a group, a political group, that doesn't have the traditional benefits of being landed, of having their wealth and their value as a result of what they owned in terms of land and possessions. And yet they are recognized inside of Athenian society and are given positions that enable them to have a say. Thus the widening, the spreading of the Athenian concept of democracy being beyond just that of the aristocracy who had a right to have a say, or those who owned land or had resources, but in this case those who had given to the benefit of the polis, who had given to the benefit of the city, the oarsman, the common water soldier, just like the common infantry soldier 10 years before, had risen to a place of prominence. It can't be underestimated also how the Greeks thought of themselves after the victory at Salamis and then ultimately Plataea. I think a very good summary of that is that by Victor Davis Hanson, the historian, who writes as follows. Before Salamis, most of the Greek city-states were agrarian, parochial, and isolated, intimidated by 70 million subjects of the Persian Empire to the east, and overshadowed by millions more in the Near East and Egypt. But after Salamis, the ancient Greeks would never again fear any other foreign power until they met the Romans. Indeed, no Persian king would ever set foot again in Greece, and for the next 2,000 years no Easterner would claim Greece as his own until the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans in the 15th century. He goes on to write that before Salamis, Athens was a rather eccentric city-state whose experiment with radical democracy was in its 27-year-old infancy, and the verdict on its success was still out. After the battle arose an imperial, democratic culture that ruled the Aegean and gave us Aeschylus, Sophocles, the Parthenon, Pericles, and Thucydides. And in fact, within 200 years, this culture that had staved off attack by the Persians would be the culture out of which Alexander arose and led his conquest heading in the direction of east, ultimately conquering what had been the Persian Empire and spreading Greek culture, Greek thought, Greek influence throughout the known world. Sort of the ultimate reversal in that in the early 5th century, Greece is fighting to survive against the expansion of Persia, and within 200 years, Persia and other powers to the east would be fighting against the expansion of Greece. Alexander comes out of the culture. He's a product of what was established and preserved here in the early 5th century BC. In fact, even Egypt, one of the great powers, would eventually fall under the rule of Ptolemy as one of the 4 generals who takes over for Alexander. And so Greek culture and influence leads us to, for example, Cleopatra, who is Egyptian, but she is foremost Greek in terms of how she thinks about things. Later, even as they are conquered by the Romans, an argument could even be made that while militarily Greece falls to Rome, that in many ways culturally and in terms of thought, Rome falls to Greece as a result of that conquest and the spread of Greek ideals back into the Roman world that ultimately spread by Rome in its empire. And after Constantine's conversion to Christianity and Christianity's growth in the latter days of the Roman Empire, we continue to see the influence that's brought in as a result of Greece moving forward, even as we move into the Christian age. For example, the New Testament is not written in Latin. The New Testament is not written in some form of language that was prominent in the Persian Empire. The New Testament is written in Greek. Greek had become the language. Simply put, Greek thought, philosophy, language have such an influence on Western culture that it's almost impossible to imagine how the quote-unquote West would have evolved without the influence of Greece. In fact, it's become so much of the norm of the way that we think in Western culture that it's hard for us to imagine that there was this moment in time when that outcome could have been very different. If it weren't for the battles there, particularly the Battle of Salamis, where the Greeks turned the tide against the Persians, that naval battle changes the course of the latter part of the Greco-Persian War and eventually leads to Greek victory. If you do not have those events, then you do not have Greece as we know it there in the early 5th century. Certainly we do not have all of the things that flow from that. The culture that we have today as those in the West would be very different because it would have been influenced by the victors, which would have been the Persians from the East. Thanks for joining us today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Hope you enjoyed and learned something out of thinking through what it would have been like if the Greeks had gone down in defeat and the Persians had risen up in victory so many years ago. If you enjoy the podcast, we certainly suggest that you subscribe. We can be found on iTunes. We can be found on Stitcher. We can be found in Google Play, your podcast reader and feeder of choice. So make sure that you subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any of our new episodes. As a general rule of thumb, we try to publish new episodes on Fridays, and so you can look forward to something there before the weekend. Certainly, if you enjoy the podcast as well, we don't do the podcast for financial gain, but you can help support us at our Patreon page. That's Patreon, A Fork in Time. There you have the opportunity to become a patron or a subscriber with some special extras that we do from time to time for patron and subscribers. And certainly one of the neat things that we allow our patrons to do is have a role in focusing and letting us know where additional future podcasts may go, giving us topic suggestions. Our Patreon supporters can also have the opportunity to be co-hosts on the podcast. So not only suggesting topics, but actually participating in the discussion. We actually think the podcast works best when it's not like today, when it's not a solo presentation, when there's the opportunity for discussion and even debate over the impacts of A Fork in Time and how history may have chosen a different path. So if you'd like to be part of the podcast in that way, you have the opportunity at our Patreon page to participate in a number of different ways as well. Again, we really do appreciate you giving us the most valuable resource that you have, which is your time, and understanding that you could spend that doing something else, and the fact that you've chosen to spend that here with us. It is certainly something that we treasure and appreciate, and we thank you for. So until next time, this is Don Shelley signing off. And we'll conclude, as we do with most episodes, by reminding you of those famous words of that great philosopher. Not a Greek philosopher, but a great philosopher nonetheless. one Yogi Berra, who said, when you get to a fork in the road, take it.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.